Hey, it's J. T. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller. Here are los cuentos de Los Angeles. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller Podcast.
It's totally worth it. And Phoenix, I have to thank you so very much for taking the time out of your schedule to join me on this installment of JT the LA Storyteller podcast. You are a reporter and audio engineer, audio producer with LA Public Press. And so I'm really excited about what you all have in store for the city of Los Angeles through this fall season, especially. And welcome. Really, it's so much fun to see you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your support. Thanks for having me on too.
110%. And the reason that we are hopping on this episode together is because actually you all have a very specific story to tell over the next couple of months as we head into this critical election year, not just for the city or for the state, but for our nation, if you will. And the story that you look to tell is one that, especially if you've considered yourself on the left in Los Angeles or a progressive in Los Angeles, you've come across many, many times in so many different respects. And so even just for you all to take this story on as you have, I think is a real testament to the ambitions you all have for storytelling in Los Angeles, for on the ground reporting in Los Angeles, and for working and speaking with communities in Los Angeles as you do these things. So I have to ask you a little bit about how this podcast, which you launched tomorrow at the time of this recording, that is on September 17th, how this first came together. I mean, tell me a little bit about that sort of behind the scene work, the buildup, if you will, for the Tenants Association by the LA Public Press this fall.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I've been following the Hillside Villa story for about 2 years. I first I was working for the NPR affiliate here, KPCC, LAist now. So I'd really been following the story a lot since pivotal vote for the Hillside Villa tenants. They're, the group of tenants in Chinatown that have been fighting rent increases for the past 6 years. And I was really interested in their story because I was interested in sort of gentrification in Chinatown and how that affects tenants, working class tenants in Chinatown, with the neighborhood that's changing and getting so expensive and becoming like a destination neighborhood, if you will. And I was really interested in the tactics the tenants were using, sort of how out front they were with, wanting to protect their housing, wanting to be treated well as tenants and everything like that. I always thought this type of story, because it'd been going on for a really long time, and it was pretty complex. I'm sure we'll get into it, but it involved eminent domain at one point. And I just thought this type of story would really lend itself to some kind of long form story, a long form podcast at LAist, because you had to put together a broadcast every day. The stories were basically like a 1-minute spot. You can't really do as much with that. And when I went to LA Public Press, I was really covering Hillside Villa for the print side, and I was actually getting a lot of public records back. I was doing a lot of public records requests. City officials were actually talking a lot about Hillside Villa and their emails and everything like that. So I published a bunch of 1,000+ word stories for LA Public Press, but I was I pitched this to my boss, Carla Green, because I was like, oh, it's such a sound rich story. They're always protesting and everything like that. They're always like out in the streets or, like holding some kind of rally in their courtyard, actually. Yeah, I just thought it would really like lend itself to an intimate look, really, where you really get to know the tenants and hear everything in their own words. And also really introduce a story that has been going on for a long time and that it's really actually really involves a lot of moving parts. It's actually like a hard story to explain like in a minute or so. And we've been working on it ever since it's September now. We've been working on it for the better part of the year. So
That's really exciting, especially because you mentioned Carla Green. I know that Carla's work previously also involved this intricate story around Jose Huizar and the rise and fall of Jose Huizar in Council District 14. That for sure was one of my favorite serial podcasts ever and still is. I definitely mentioned that to Carla, but I'm happy to like uplift that once again now. And so I know that there's a lot of experience for this kind of real layered storytelling, as you described it. And so, in that respect, where did you begin? Where is it that you sort of started to put a few of the pieces together and a few of the outlines together, since these stories have involved so many different players? Where did you start, given all of that?
yeah, yeah, and I echo that. I was also really inspired by the sellout. I thought like when I heard that podcast, I was like, this is amazing. Like this is uh, the first time I've heard about this story about Jose Huizar, like actually from the perspective of the people most affected by his policies and by his wrongdoing and everything like that. So yeah, that was totally an inspiration for this podcast. And how we started, we did extensive outlining at the beginning. That was really key because again, we're trying to cram 6 years worth of activism into a 4-episode podcast. I also I have like a ton of archival scene tape and everything like that, just like hours and hours of tape that I couldn't even fit into my previous stories. That I just like went through and just like put into our drive and everything like that. And then also a big part was getting the permission and well, the buy-in really of the Hillside Villa tenants. I had spoken to them over the years, like for my story, but this would sort of necessitate like longer interviews, like multiple interviews. So it was really important to have them on board. We really wanted to tell this from their perspective foremost. So yeah, I think probably the very beginning was me just emailing them and being like, is this something you're into? And getting that yes was really important. So yeah, we kind of just went from there. Um, we started interviewing the organizers, and then we set up interviews actually with mainly the Spanish speaking tenants, especially the Spanish speaking women. Actually, because I don't speak Spanish, so I actually hadn't talked to them as much as I wanted to, like when I started out doing this. But there are a lot of people at LA Public Press who are bilingual, and then we actually ended up hiring a bilingual producer reporter named Martin Macias, who's great as well. He contributed so much, but basically, we wanted to sort of again talk to the Spanish-speaking women, many of whom are elders who have lived at Hillside Villa for decades, who have raised children there. They're kind of unsung, so to speak. There have been multiple leaders of the tenant association over the years, but yeah, there's sometimes it's easy to overlook them and everything like that due to the language barrier, due to the fact that they're not as out there sometimes. So we actually started with them and we did like interviews in Spanish with them, and then they were translated after the facts. And then that kind of informed sort of how we started to report this podcast. And in the background, we were doing a lot of public records requests. We were trying to track down the original covenant over Hillside Villa, the reason why the rents at Hillside Villa have stayed low until 2018 when this whole thing started. So yeah, we kind of like ran around City Hall and around the city archives looking for all of that stuff. We tracked down like old tenants of Hillside Villa. We tried to research into the original owner of Hillside Villa because actually the current landlord wasn't the original owner of the building. So we actually did a lot of investigative work.
I think that's fantastic, especially because you mentioned looking not necessarily at the first row, so to speak, but at those behind the scenes, those who are showing up, though not necessarily always in front of the limelight. I think that's a very comprehensive way of engaging the larger community that is all around something like a tenants association, right? So I very much appreciate that. And then we will certainly get into affordable housing as well as eminent domain shortly or briefly. But before then, I want to ask you, for someone who is maybe just coming across this story tomorrow, as soon as this podcast launches, when did the Chinatown Hillside Villa Tenants Association begin, and where is the story now? I mean, why are we looking into this in the first place, especially now when we have elections to contend with and the election season to contend with? How is it that we sort of describe that to them?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. I guess I would tell somebody who doesn't know anything about this story that this is about, a group of tenants, working class tenants in Chinatown who were served with rent increases of thousands of dollars. And where the story really begins is that they decided to fight back. They didn't decide to leave or to move out, which is what a lot of people would have done. And I think understandably, but they knew that they had rights, and they were determined to organize, and to really be able to stay like in these homes that they had lived. Some people had lived at Hillside Villa for over 20 years and everything like that. So yeah, I would tell them that this is a story about how you can build solidarity with your neighbors, how you can build a tenant association in your building, and really stay put and fight. And basically, like it's sort of a story about what happens when you stay and fight. And it's really, it's a difficult fight for sure. But who knows where these tenants would be if they just decided to sort of accept the rent increase or to accept the cash payments they were offered to leave. I think, an organizer said that these rent increases were tantamount to an eviction notice because they were like the increases were so high that there was no way that these tenants would be able to pay them. And, that was pretty obvious. So I think the podcast, the appeal of the podcast really is like, how do you, knowing that, how do you sort of take your power back from somebody who you might perceive as having more power and resources than you?
Yeah, and I hear, especially when you note this, two major components, right? Like you mentioned cash for keys, for example. And I can't help but think about how many people have been lost over the last couple of decades to the cash for keys program, right? I wish that there were some way to track this, but the city, as you have probably found out, is far less apt for such things than it should be, given the scope of the housing crisis in Los Angeles, especially, right? And then the power of speaking up and making a claim or making a case for one's right to stay, because this story, especially when we describe it as a story about affordable housing and the expiration of a covenant, when we get into all this legalese, and when you talk about language barriers and non-native English speakers, and also aging seniors, aging renters. I mean, you're talking about so many people, not just across Los Angeles County or even the state of California, but across the nation, right? Like folks who may not necessarily at the outset seem equipped to deal with such things because they do not tend to have the budget for lawyers or attorneys or large legal teams who can take this all on for them. And yet, in unifying and finding a way to conduct these meetings and to reach out to these public officials and to make a lot of noise and get a lot of eyes on the story, that says so much about just what communities can do, right? And so I really appreciate your shouting it out as a story that concerns any renter anywhere. Because get this, you can start a tenants association too. This is just one example of that. And so, yeah, it makes me only that much more stoked to get into that first episode, which once again drops this Tuesday, September 17th for folks. And you mentioned earlier that it's a 4-episode series.
Yes, it'll be an episode a week. Although the 4th episode, believe it or not, the story is still going on. So the 4th episode there might be 2 weeks between episode 3 and 4 because the story actually isn't over.
Of course. And so actually to that end, for someone who is actually familiar with the Chinatown Hillside Villa Tenants Association, how is it that we center affordable housing and what that means or what that has meant and how it's been interpreted differently for communities to engage with out here? Because I think that really calling out affordable housing as a term is quite overdue. And it should no longer be just a phrase that a political figure gets to tout out there, but something that we can really scrutinize for how it actually is not all it seems cut out to be.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'll start with so in terms of Hillside Villa, Hillside Villa was built with an affordability covenant, which is basically a contract where the landlord will agree to keep rents restricted, rent increases restricted for a specific period of time. In this case, it was 30 years. And in exchange, the landlord gets subsidies, usually tax credits, federal tax credits, and everything like that. And this sort of this sort of really gained traction during the Reagan era, where, this idea of actually funding the private sector to build affordable housing. That was supposed to sort of solve all of our housing shortage problems in America and everything like that, without having to do public housing, which has been really demonized in the United States. So there's this notion that, you can have private developers build affordable housing, so-called affordable housing, and you can give them money to do it. And the problem is that developers, I think they want their developments to pencil, which means they want, their developments to make money and stuff like that. And it's kind of opposed to housing people, especially people who don't have a lot of money to pay like high rents and everything like that. I think the problem specifically with Hillside Villa is what happens when this covenant expires. Well, the landlord can raise the rents by, to market rate, which, as we all know, in LA is very high. A lot of people can't afford market rate housing in LA. So that's a huge problem, and it's a huge problem throughout the United States. I think there's a National Housing Preservation Database, and it estimates that over 800,000 apartments throughout the country, their affordability protections will expire in the next 10 years. So it's really, really exacerbating this housing crisis in the nation, in California, and in LA. And Hillside Villa, was really is unique. I mean, it's unique these days in that it has been affordable to low income, very low income tenants, since it was built because of this covenant. But you have a lot of affordable housing developments coming online now that are for people, so-called moderate income people. And that means like incomes of like 80,000 or something like that, which is pretty high, actually. There are a lot of people in LA who don't make that amount of money. So yeah, when you say affordable housing, it's really affordable for who? It isn't as common to have like housing set aside for people who are making way less than that. And also, it's not as common now to have apartments like affordable housing that that's 2 bedroom or 3 bedroom, where you really can have a family living there. And actually, that's another great thing about Hillside Villa is that it had a lot of apartments that are 2 or 3 bedroom, but that's really not as common now.
Yeah, I think affordable for who is a great question to ask, and then also affordable for how long, right? Because clearly we are getting into the details of this here. For our clarification, when was Hillside Villa first built or established? When did Hillside Villa get online so as to begin that 30-year covenant process?
Yeah, in 1989.
In 1989, during the Reagan era, or just
Yeah.
after the Reagan era, as you had said, certainly a reverberation of that time. Okay. Okay.
Actually, during this, what are they called? The redevelopment agency era. Yeah, it was built using.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And another term that is of importance for us here is this term eminent domain. And an eminent domain is, well, it's such an interesting nut to crack for me because you see examples of eminent domain historically and how that process has worked, including just right by in what Vincent Che Montalvo would call Bishop La Loma and Palo Verde, or what a lot of folks out there know as the Chavez Ravine, which was taken forcibly by eminent domain. Eminent domain has also figured in this story because a lot of folks have said, hey, now that the shoe is on the other foot or is supposed to be, why don't we use eminent domain to claim this building back and to claim all of these affordable housing covenant timelines back from these would-be profiteers? So can you tell us a little bit about eminent domain's role in the Chinatown Hillside Villa Tenants Association stories?
Yeah, for sure. It's a big part. Yeah. So eminent domain is the government power, any government, that they can use this power to take private property, as long as they prove that it's for a public purpose and they pay the original owner the so-called fair market price. So it's basically forcing the sale of private property to the government. And like you said, eminent domain figures into the Dodger Stadium story because yeah, there were 3 neighborhoods in what is commonly known as Chavez Ravine, but to the locals there, it was like you said, La Loma, Palo Verde, and Bishop, right? And so there were a lot of Mexican American families like living in those neighborhoods, but the government took their land through eminent domain, and they were actually going to build public housing there. But then they dropped that idea a few years later. This started in the early 1950s, and they dropped that idea because business interests were saying, oh, like building public housing, that's like communist, it's like anti-American. We don't want that. And then a new mayor was elected and he killed the projects. And a bunch of families stayed there. A bunch of families living in those neighborhoods, they were holdouts. They stayed in their homes. They refused to sell their homes to the government, to the city. not to the city, sorry, to the federal government. Yeah, the federal government had at first, seized the land through eminent domain. But basically, there were a lot of families who refused to leave. And so they went through this court process for years. And finally, but at the end of the 1950s, the last families were forced to leave. I think that there's the famous photo of one, her name is Aurora Vargas, I think. She's being dragged out of her home by sheriff's deputies. And then, then at the end of the 1950s, the city sold the land to the Dodgers, and that's why Dodger Stadium is there and everything like that. So I think eminent domain, I think rightfully has a really bad reputation because it's used to it's been used throughout the country to bulldoze neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods where a lot of people of color live. A lot of working class people live, to build highways, stadiums, and everything like that. And I think the Hillside Villa tenants, when they learned about eminent domain, they were like, why does eminent domain have to mean displacement of tenants? Maybe it could mean saving housing for tenants. And in their case, they thought that if they could force a sale of Hillside Villa to the city, that would save them from these rent increases. And at the time that they considered this, the landlord had been negotiating a deal with the council member at the time, their council member, Gil Cedillo, to extend their covenants by 10 more years. So 10 more years of affordable rents. But the deal fell apart. And Tom Botts is the landlord. He didn't sign the deal. So they the tenants didn't feel like they could depend on their electeds or on their landlord. So they kind of wanted to basically take control, and they thought eminent domain would be the method to doing that. It's a radical idea. There's been quite some opposition to it, but the amazing thing is they actually persuaded Gil Cedillo, who at the time was a very powerful council member, to actually put it on the agenda, and the city actually voted to consider using eminent domain. Ultimately, they didn't do it for a lot of reasons, but to even get the city to consider something like that is just amazing. And I think the Hillside Villa tenants got a lot of attention because they were able to do something like that.
Definitely, Phoenix. And for our reference, for our knowledge just as well, when we note these tenants and when we acknowledge the language barriers, and when we also shout out the variance, just how different everyone is, even while they're coming together for a common struggle. Maybe you can tell us a bit about who these folks are and what they have done for a living and what their role has been for the city of Los Angeles overall, because though they might be low income, they, I imagine, have spent quite some time creating their community and also contributing to the greater whole that is our city. So would you tell me a little bit about what these folks have done to get by and what they continue to do as workers in Los Angeles, actually?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, so some of them, let's see, some of the tenants, they work in construction, they're food vendors. One of the tenants owns a hot dog truck that's parked downtown. Yeah, they work really hard. They raise their families. They're also taking care of elderly parents and everything like that. The cool thing about Hillside Villa too is that there's it's sort of two buildings that form a courtyard, a really big courtyard. And so the tenants are able to gather there, have a barbecue. I think one tenant that we spoke to, she used to have her children's quinceañeras there. They've had a community garden there, which sort of became a battleground. The kids can play there and everything like that. Yeah, they've really, by virtue of like how the building is set up, a lot of the neighbors, like over the years, have really formed a community and everything like that. Especially again, like the women, Spanish speaking women who would like sort of gather in the courtyard and talk a lot. And then they sort of became the backbone of the tenant association because they already knew each other. And there's one tenant in particular named Luisa who actually was really determined to fight these rent increases and sort of recruited them and everything like that. They have contributed so much to LA. They've been in LA for so long. In terms of this fight, they really were really enthusiastic about, holding rallies, doing direct action, which, could mean showing up to the landlord's house in Malibu to protest what he's doing, or showing up at Gil Cedillo's fundraiser, to sort of pressure him to put eminent domain on the agenda during election year. And more recently, they went to their current council member's house, Eunices Hernandez. They protested her because of what they say is her role in, current negotiations that they've had to have with their landlord and everything like that. And I think, their power really comes from the fact that they've made like really powerful people in the city take notice, and they really like very publicly like changed the conversation about housing and what's possible in terms of tenants' rights, in terms of actually, like securing housing that's affordable for low income tenants like them. Through their protests, through their actions. And there's a lot of joy in their actions too. It's not just serious stuff. There's a lot of like mischief and everything. Like there's one tenant named Alejandro who has written a bunch of songs that he sings about like their rights as tenants, about how housing is like a human right and everything like that, that they sing and everything like that. So
Folksy.
yeah. They've really done a lot to like raise their families, take care of each other, and then also to really push forward tenants' rights in LA.
It sounds like they've really leveraged the assets around them. And so my sort of lingering question when it comes to struggles in communities like those the Tenants Association is facing now in Chinatown is just what the strengths and challenges of their specific neighborhood are, who the sort of program providers have been, what the history has looked like, what the geography is, what are we proximate to and also far from. All of these questions inform the sort of real assets that folks can leverage when they are organizing, correct? And so I do think that the Chinatown Hillside Villa Tenants Association has very much done that, including through the support of the Los Angeles Tenants Union, which has done integral work in LA over the past decade, especially, I'd say. And now I'm aware of only more tenants associations across the city, this one being a very prominent one for good reason, but it's exciting as we think about, possibilities for the city and more struggle, actually, as the 2028 Olympics make their way into town and as real estate becomes ever more precious, ever more soluble for these profiteers out there bent on having their way at the expense of these working class communities.
Yeah. The tenants organize with the LA Tenants Union. They also organize with Chinatown Community for Equitable Development, or CCD, which is an organization of anti-gentrification organization in Chinatown. Because like I said, Chinatown has gentrified a lot. There are a lot of like art galleries, music venues / bars, that have moved in. Rents, like apartment rents have really gone up a lot in Chinatown and everything like that. The low income tenants, many of whom are immigrants. They've lost a lot of their resources there. Like several years ago, this large grocery store in Chinatown closed because of rent hikes and everything like that. So the fact that the Hillside Villa tenants have been able to organize with CCD and Lot 2 and everything like that's really been helpful. Chinatown is a really like up and coming neighborhood, so-called. So that, adds a challenge because again, Chinatown was a neighborhood, is and was a neighborhood for, immigrants. A lot of Chinese speaking immigrants have moved to the San Gabriel Valley. So that's one part of it. Again, a lot of like the high-end businesses have moved in. The rents have really been driven up. There's a fight right now over a developer wanting to build a gondola to Dodger Stadium through Chinatown. And a lot of the tenants there like really oppose it, saying it'll really destroy the neighborhood further. And the gondola coincides with the Olympics, as you had mentioned. The tenants, are also strong because they are in solidarity with other tenant associations. So, going back to the Olympics, a lot of the Flower Drive tenants who live near USC in the 110, and their landlord has been trying to evict them in order to build, I guess, housing or some kind of development that'll coincide with the Olympics or cater to the Olympic crowd, everything like that. A lot of the Flower Drive tenants have been showing up to Hillside Villa tenant actions. I think because, they have a lot in common in terms of displacement, in terms of the city's inadequate response to what they're going through and everything like that. The unique challenges are that the Hillside Villa Tenant Association, there are at least 3 languages spoken, Spanish, English, and Cantonese, at the very least. So, that's where Lot 2 really comes in, and CCD, because a lot of the organizers are bilingual or even trilingual, and they take that really seriously, language justice. So they always have simultaneous interpretation at their meetings. We'll get into that in the podcast. It's really important to them so that everybody can understand what's going on and feel comfortable, feel empowered, in meetings and actions and everything like that. Hillside Villa is on a hill overlooking Chinatown. And what's a really cool thing about it is that there are these really long stairs that actually lead down to Chinatown. If you walk down these stairs, you get to the bottom. At the foot of the stairs is basically the library, another great public space. And so, it's a really great location. It's a really convenient location for the tenants that live there. I think it really raises the question of there's been a lot of change for Chinatown, but who has it benefited, and why can't Chinatown get the resources for people who've lived there for a long time to stay? Why does it have to be that Chinatown improves, but the original residents get displaced? I think the Hillside Villa tenants, they've had the relationships in order to be able to organize effectively and to stay, everything like that. Even at the beginning when they actually meet in the courtyard of Hillside Villa, and it's kind of risky because the landlord or the people who work for the landlord can hear what they're doing. But at the beginning, because of their connection to CCD, they were able to actually meet in other places in Chinatown if they needed to. And they're still able to do that.
Don't worry about it, bots.
Yeah, they're even meeting at the Burger King at first on Cesar Chavez. So, but they've since, they've been able to meet at different spots in Chinatown because, something as simple as that. Yeah, they've had a lot of like advantages in that sense.
What a story, or as we say around here, what a cuento for Los Cuentos de Los Angeles, because I also think about this long history of Chinatown and actually the forced removal of the original Chinatown from where Union Station was located farther east in the name of transit. Right. And so here we have Los Angeles about 100 years later in a very different position, but one that is still very much informed by the working class's struggle and their efforts against these profiteers. And so I do think that these unique challenges are very much something to contend with and something that draw this battle out as long as they have. And we don't know exactly what the outcome will be here, but I do feel that getting this story more light and more time and more depth, more community even for the city of Los Angeles is going to play a significant role in the back and forth. So I really got to thank you for joining me to discuss this work and to let us peer into this special program y'all are putting together for the city.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, Phoenix. Absolutely. Okay. Any final notes regarding the podcast, what to watch out for, when are episodes being published, and what else might we expect from Los Angeles Public Press for the Tenants Association?
It's called the Tenant Association. And of course, I forgot to mention that at the beginning. I got to work on that, but yes.
We're gonna place it in the show notes and the title. So
okay, awesome, great, yes, thank you so much. The first episode drops again Tuesday, September 17th, and then each episode will come out on every Tuesday. It'll be 4 episodes, and there might be a little more of a lag between 3 and 4 because, like I said, we do have to lock episode 4 at some point, but the story is still ongoing. There's actually a major development today. So stay tuned for that. But we kind of have to find this, really, we have to really pinpoint where we're going to end it because things keep changing. So.
Of course they do. Of course they do. The story is always ongoing and changing, and it is as gratifying as it is confounding. Right.
Yes.
I can absolutely see it and I can hear it in your notes. And actually, okay, just one final wraparound question. If it should work for you, I'm curious about who's hosting the podcast. Are you able to share that with us, or should we stay tuned and just wait and see? Although by the time this comes out on Friday, September 20th or whatever that may be, you will have already published the first episode and the host will be known. So maybe you can tell us now.
Yeah. Oh, yes. The host is me.
Wow. Let's go.
Oh, that's so funny. I was like, oh, that's like an obvious thing I should say is that I'm the host.
Well, yes. I really have to thank you, Phoenix, the host of the new Tenants Association podcast by the Los Angeles Public Press. I am excited to hear this cuento from you all, and I'm really grateful that JT the LA Storyteller could play a part in uplifting this for folks out there. So let's do it. Let's get it out there. And thank you once again for joining me this evening.
Thank you so much. Thanks again for having me.
Hey. It's J. T. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller. Here are Los Cuentos de Los Angeles. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller Podcast.